Good evening. How are you? I'm in my basement gym because it's raining so much outside, so I'm doing a stand and talk. Not a punch and talk, a stand and talk. The uh, the thing that bothers me about where we stand today is it seems to me there are a number of failures that nobody addresses. The failures go something like this. Do we have justice in America, or is it so penetrated with prejudices seen and unseen that it is distorted? Is it also a system that, because of capitalism and a distortion of capitalism and the relationship with the working men and women, that we also have problems in our so-called justice system? I'm also interested in the fact that we are not all equal before the law. So let me do a couple of broad brush efforts at what I think is wrong. If we go back through history, it's easy for us today to say we would never do that. So what do we think about the Dred Scott decision? Here we have a Supreme Court under Justice Taney who decided that a man, Dred Scott, was property. So he didn't have any human rights when challenging and demanding his liberty as a free man. Now, people say today that they would never have supported that. But is that true? Would they say that the Constitution made provision for slavery by the way it was arranged? How slaves were counted but couldn't vote? How slaves were necessary to the Southern marketplace? How any new state had to be carefully considered whether slave or free? And this is a broad brush. Now, there were some abolitionists who opposed it, but there was a debate in America of whether a human who was a person of color who worked and was a servant, a slave, whether that person was entitled to be treated as a human, as a right. And in Dred Scott, it was decided no. Would people today come down with the same decision? Now, going forward to the 1920s, and I'm a trial lawyer, so I think about these cases, but this is one case that swept across the world, and it was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Now, the story, if you know it, is that there was a robbery, and in that robbery, there were two people who went into the robbery, and then there were several in a getaway car. They didn't have a clear run on who did it. They finally identified Sacco and Vanzetti, but they never had enough proof to prove that case. Sacco had a gun, but it had a different identification than the one that was used, but that difference was withheld from the jury, and the prosecutor purposefully hid that information. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian. Their views were more radical, but it was never made clear that the robbery had anything to do with political ideology. Yet, they were described from the beginning as Italian and agitators and wrong. There's nothing in Ohio right now that's going on anything like that. And there is that statement, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And sometimes it is identical except for the names, the context, and so forth. Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted at a trial, and the sentence was to be a death penalty. There are a couple of different thoughts about this. People who were esteemed lawyers came forward and took the side of Sacco and Vanzetti, said this was unfair from beginning to end. And the trial judge himself had biases against these Italian activists. And he was very comfortable with a death sentence for Sacco and Vanzetti. There were challenges, there was a commission, but no politician had the nerve to say, stop the music. That passed for justice. Oh, take another jump. The case of Plessy against Ferguson. Person could ride in the front of the bus, provided that their skin was lighter than a paper bag that was used to determine whether it was a person of color, who therefore was slave, who had to sit in the back of the bus. There are various renditions of this. But the question was, well, it was separate, but was it equal? Of course, they said it was separate and equal. So you start seeing the framework of our justice system from the bottom up has problems. And it often goes back to the differences in race. Now, leaping forward to 1954, we have Brown against the Board of Education. And there's a long history that comes with that. But the bottom line is, were children of color and families of color segregated and prevented from receiving the schooling that other students were getting? So this takes us from Plessy against Ferguson, separate but equal, to Brown against the Board of Education. There were briefs put together to show that this was not equal before the law. Excuse me. And the question is, how far have we advanced today? We go on from that point, and we consider cases in which a person could be prosecuted who was married, who consented with the spouse to use birth control pills. In Connecticut, they made that a crime. Interesting. The accusation against the law, the legal reasoning was that we have a right to privacy, which means a right to be let alone. When you think of the Fourth Amendment search and seizure, you think of the Fifth Amendment, which is due process, which is basic fairness. So you start getting a scheme of injustice that is like, and I may have said this before, like a river just below the surface. And you don't realize it's there, and then it surfaces at the worst times in the most horrible ways. We had women at the creation of our country, but they were chattels. They were not people. So you see, if you're a humanist, if you're a Christian, if you're an agnostic, if you're an atheist, at the bottom, you believe we are all part of each other. You do, I think, if you refer to the context of your personal structure and psychology and your DNA, and if you are otherwise, you are different, and perhaps in a way that is hard for you to negotiate the world. Now, is Trump in that world? Yes. Now let's elaborate on the equal before the law. In addition to these things in which there's a distortion in fair play for treating a person as property, for telling kids that they can't go to the better school, but where they are is separate, but it's equal. And you tell married couples they can't have birth control, they don't have a right of privacy, and so on and so forth. So we can go through all of these. There's even a decision when business seemed to be uppermost as a determinant on the contract between a member of the capital state, businessmen, and the workers, the middle class. And so that they could consent to work longer than 9 to 5, work 7 days, work overtime without pay. The children could work. The conditions didn't have to be safe. So you get the feeling that this exceptional society, with the freedom it does have and that it's fought to have, has been compromised from the very first when the state was created. Now, having painted this terrible picture, we have made enormous advances. We have amended our Constitution, even as Republicans would prefer we only follow the understandings of our founding fathers, who had these primitive ideas and only looked to white and had a view about slavery and about women and other things that we have evolved from. And in recent years, with different legislation, we have set a bar that America must meet so that people do have rights and they have dignity and they have a right to complain and that they're supposed to get a fair and just trial. Which takes me to my next prong, which is this. On the one hand, we see certain people generally getting a better deal. And then the rest of us get another kind of deal, another kind of justice. Now, I often tell clients that every case involves three factors. First, do you have a complaint or a defense, whether the case is civil or criminal? Two, can you prove what you claim, whether the case is civil or criminal, whether or not you have to prove it? And third, how much justice can you afford? So even when fighting a system tilted toward business, it's also tilted toward resources. And if you don't have the resources, it affects your ability to stand and fight for your rights. Now, in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, one of them had an ironclad alibi as being someplace else and working, and there were documents that proved it, and the jury pushed that aside. Bias, prejudice. We try to eliminate these things in court, but prosecutors who care more about winning than doing justice resist that. And the proof of that is that people are prosecuted, convicted, and some sent to death, although they're innocent. Sacco and Vanzetti. I choose it because it's handy, but a friend of mine in New York has this Innocence Project, and he's taken the science of DNA, and he has used that to examine cases where this material was saved by an investigator to test the thesis whether, in some cases where DNA can tell us something, the person committed the crime. And repeatedly, the Innocence Project has found people were wrongly convicted. There's no justification for imprisoning an innocent man, nor is there any good cause to let in junk science. That is, science we claim means one thing, but it doesn't. For example, a lineup. You put 5 people up there and you look at them and I said, you recognize any of these as the perpetrator? And they can't tell you. And then they think about it, and they're encouraged to think about it. And what happens is, and there have been psychological tests to show this, what happens then is if the person's not there, but someone who looks like that person, then they may identify him. So identifications are difficult. Snitches come out of jails and tell people things. Prosecutors overcharge. In other words, if you did one crime, they charge 10. If a defendant should be punished, they want it to be some multiple of what would be considered proportional in the case. So we have a poison, a toxin in our system that affects charging decisions and outcomes and what favor people get. You and I are not in that group. Then we have the rest of the system, and you have a chance, if you have the resources to fight it, if you have evidence. Now, if you don't have the resources, people will plead guilty to things they didn't do rather than risk the riskier and worse sentence. So what are we seeing in America right now? Give it a snapshot that brings it close to home. We see the advantage of business in everything that Trump has experienced, the power that he had as president. He is allowed to abuse that power now, even as he tried to overthrow the government, and all the king's men and all the king's horses seemingly can't give a damn to stop him dead in his tracks. That's unacceptable. How do we call ourselves a republic and a democracy when we let this go on? But even if you're not dealing at that level, you have his associates and so forth. And again, there you have a hybrid. You have somebody who has an escape clause in the system because they're connected to Trump and to various institutions and power centers. And they have access to lawyers and small fortunes because the people who are at risk have that kind of a reputation. Bush Sr., as you may know, was, as a result of advice, encouraged to give pardons to several people that might have revealed his role in an unjust and unlawful war, the Iran-Contra affair. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that when people say this is the most important election in your life, it is. And the pivot point is this truncated system of bias, inequity, and punishment for the working class and the poor to maintain those at levels that are suitable to the wealthiest. Now, this may sound like some radical pathology, but it's not. It's demonstrable. You can read the statistics. You can look at all the studies and know this. And so instead of talking about Trump losing by a whisker and how that upends all the stories he told, we talk about something that's ridiculous, which is how Trump fills the airwaves with bullshit. And he's talking about Haitians eating geese and pets. When these people are properly here, they're not unlawful, they're not illegal, and the word is that Trump is going to go into that center. So, a long time ago, there was a gonzo journalist, Hunter Thompson, and he talked about fear and loathing on the campaign trail. And it hasn't changed. It's gotten worse. And so we started a path away from the dystopia that Trump and too many Republicans once responsible allowed. And in 2020, Biden took the first step to restore our country. This year, after Trump managed to win in 2020, after he lost in 2020, this year we managed to bar him completely. That's our job. That's what we have to do. So I stand here among weights waiting to be clanked and pushed around. And I think it's a fitting backdrop because we say when we fight, we win. And it's true. If we fight, and we fight every day in the remaining days, and we point out all the nonsense and the inequities and so forth, we will win on November the 5th. We will give the backbone that our political leaders need, and we will start on a future path, not looking back except to guard against repeating the errors of the past. And we have to drain that invisible river of discrimination, slander, hate, and monarchy that runs just below the ground, with a minority of people that don't know any better, praise for being uneducated, praise for accepting the most bizarre statements made. When Holly and I went door knocking the other day, I don't want to single anyone out, but there were a couple who were Trump supporters who just took to these crazy ideas. And I've only been on a couple of cruises, but on one I went, you gather at the table. We stopped doing that because you eat too much. And I tried to be on my best behavior and not talk politics. And some people would goad me a little bit to talk, and I would try to keep it as reserved as I could to be pleasant. But everybody at the table had the same view. And so one evening before we went down to dinner, I was watching Fox News, happened to be on. I'm sitting there and I'm watching it. We go to the table, and these people were repeating exactly what was on that show. Exactly. Once before, I may have mentioned a Jesuit who said to us that we all thought we were top students and so forth. He says, but if you're just memorizing, that's nothing. How do you use your mind? How do you use your mind? There are a lot of people in America not using their mind, and we have to make up for them because this is serious business. We are challenging world history if we can keep our republic, as was the question by Benjamin Franklin. So, again, sorry I'm in the basement. Hopefully tomorrow I'll be out on a dry road as we approach the fall and the chillier days. All the best. Bye-bye.